evening, everyone. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Teacher Certification course. Please be seated. Keep wanting to say I'll be your host for this evening, but not the case. Be your teacher for this evening. We are going to be continuing, if you've been following along, we are in the self-control unit number 3 of the intermediate series of the character education program. Now I'm hoping that this is not the same fly that was bothering Chris and William. Come back to test our resolve to practice self-control. All right, so we are in chapter 5, and I wanted to go back really quick here and just I want to look back at Lesson Plan 5, page C, just to review our purpose and objective for what we're covering as we continue to move forward in this lesson. I'll kind of move a little, bit forward here in today's lesson, and then David will be picking up from where I left off today or this evening. And if you just go back, and of course the title is Maintaining Your Self-Control, and let's just reread the purpose and objective just to keep our minds, stay fast on the purpose and the goal of what we're wanting to accomplish with our students. And of course, as we go through the lessons and some of the things you hear and some of the things that support the material that's presented, and as a teacher, you're going to bring forth material to your class that is supporting of the lessons, the material, to help it kind of drive home a little bit more. Now, of course, we're training teachers and enhancing and perfecting and honing and polishing your ability to teach this, but you also are going to be not only training your students but eventually training teachers as well to continue this trend. And if you look at the purpose and objective, that's on Lesson Plan 5, page C, and it says students will learn how influences can affect their ability to maintain their self-control. So we see here, and we've covered in the last, this will be the last 6 classes or so, 5 classes, in this chapter, you kind of get the theme of the main focus in influences. Why are we going over influences again? Didn't we cover influences in character? Didn't we cover influences in acceptance? Yes, we've covered it there. We'll cover it here. We'll cover it in the next couple of books as well, because they're very important. They are very powerful, motivating pressure or source when it comes to the behaviors of young people, older people alike as well. But of course, remember, we're trying to get these things pushed in the minds of young people, and that's what this curricula pretty much is directed at, and it works for everybody, but in regards to teaching young people, they're very impressionable. Now, influences affect us all, right? Some are bold and some are subtle, but the older you get, and I think the more exposure we've had to things over a period of time, the less likely we are to be influenced by certain things. Kind of like, when people try to persuade you to do certain things, and you've seen that form of persuasion 100 times before, you're less likely to give in to that, because through experience you've learned that when certain things are presented to you, if you go along with them, they can bring about these kind of consequences. So you become a little bit more aware of the type of influences that some people might be trying to present to you in order to get their way. Sometimes it's a selfish motive. Sometimes it is a beneficial motive. But having the know-how to be able to recognize the difference between a positive influence and a negative influence, and to take a little bit of a step back and consider, if first, is this positive? B, is this negative? If I follow this course based on this influence that's being presented to me, what are going to be the results? What are going to be the rewards if I go along with this influence, right? Because everything's going to have a consequence or a reward, every decision that we make. And like it was mentioned in the previous classes, and you'll hear it over and over again, The one thing that we have to take into consideration is, will the choice that I am considering making, you remind your students this, is the choice that I am considering, will it bring harm to myself, others, or the environment? Okay? And that really pretty much sums it up, when it comes to that. I mean, that covers a whole array of things, because it's not talking about merely physical harm. It's not talking about only emotional harm. Harm could be in any form, right? It could be a person's reputation, right? It can be emotions. It can be physical, and so will this decision bring harm to myself, others, or the environment? So this is why, the push is so great on influences, because a person can come to a class or several classes and learn this information and then take it home and practice it for a while until something takes place and a certain pull comes from peers and the desire to conform and that pressure, that peer pressure comes upon them, right? Now they're faced with, do I want to maintain this character trait of self-control, or do I kind of want to just push it off just for a little while, so I can fit in and be accepted by my peers? And remember, we talked about that in the second unit on acceptance and the consequences that can come with that, but it's not always consequences. Sometimes it's negative consequences. Sometimes it's beneficial things. If you have a group of peers that are encouraging you to do positive things, but in mentioning that would never conflict with what you're learning here, right? That would never conflict with maintaining your character trait, in this case of what we're going over, of self-control. If they're positive friends, if they're beneficial friends, they're motivating and encouraging you towards positive goals and so forth. So students will learn how influences can affect their ability to maintain their self-control. And of course, that's maintaining something is to keep it in great working order, to protect it, to value it, to watch over it, and so forth. They will also learn how to apply self-control to distinguish between positive and negative influences. See, we've got both sides of the coin here, right? How influences can affect your ability to maintain self-control. Well, in order to be able to do that, like was mentioned earlier, you have to be able to distinguish those influences between positive and negative, and not let others bring them down to their level. That is, the level of others who want to take away your positive character traits. I remember when I was going to school, in high school, and that's probably in junior high as well. If a person was kind of an upstanding student, if they spoke respectfully to the teachers and principals and counselors, if they spoke respectfully to their fellow peers, if they didn't use foul language and cursing and things like that, I noticed that there will always be, at some point throughout the school year, a person or a group of people who would try to get that person, that individual, to do or say something bad. They would try to get them to use foul language. They would try to get them to break a rule. It was like they couldn't stand to see that person making right choices. They couldn't stand to see that person upholding a positive character. Okay, and there's going to be people like that in society all over, right? Our goal is to not, have the student worry about that. They can't worry about things they can't control. They can't focus on the fact that there's going to be people out there it seems like their goal is to try to get you, to throw you off course, to get you to do something that could bring harm to yourself, right? To make a bad decision, to ruin your own reputation. No, it's for them to be able to recognize the difference between what is beneficial and what is not, and to, have the desire and the value for themselves to maintain their positive character traits that they've worked so hard to develop, right? Because it could take a lifetime, as we read, to develop a positive character, and it could be lost in one single act, right? And then people will look at you It's like they don't remember any of the great things that you did all your life, and they'll come down on you. Man, I can't believe you did that. I am so ashamed of you, you know. And it can take years to rebuild that positive reputation that you had that was given in just, you know, for a number of reasons. Sometimes it is peer pressure. Sometimes it is doing something that, you know, leads to a series of other consequences, right? Like trying alcohol, underage drinking. You know, I just want to, you know, everybody's talking about it. You know, these are my friends, blah, 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 you know. Well, you just try it one time, and next thing you know, you're intoxicated. Or they roofied, you know, they put something in the drink to cause you to pass out, and next thing you know, there's all types of pictures and videos on the internet and circulating around the neighborhood. I mean, it's just one time something like that can occur. So that's why we have to get them to understand that their life is very precious. They're very valuable. Their character, as we're talking about, maintaining a positive character, maintaining the character trait of self-control is very precious. It should be very valuable to them, and they shouldn't want to do anything that would jeopardize or bring them one or two steps down from the work that they've worked to build up all this time. So that's just to put in our minds and refresh what our purpose and goal and why we're going over these things, again, because these are factors that can trip a person up and cause them to, like I said, get off course, get off track, and bring themselves a few notches down by making an impulsive decision that can cause them to ruin their reputation. So last class, we talked a little bit about the influences of television, and we're kind of continuing on to that in this class as well, showing how, you know, through certain studies, the average amount of time that is spent watching television per week for young people, it's pretty high. You know, even back in the early 2000s, according to this Nielsen Media report on page 122, it was approximately 19 hours and 40 minutes. That's still a lot of time watching television. 19 hours and 40 minutes. That's almost like a part-time job, you know, on the lower end of the hours there. And then we looked at page 123 as we covered, you know, how witnessing acts of violence harms the mind, right? And is not as harmless as a person might think. A person might think, well, I'm just going to go watch this movie, you know. Yeah, you know, it's a shoot 'em up movie, and, you know, 50 years ago or 60 years ago, it used to be the, you know, cowboys and Indians, and it used to be kind of the war movies that were really big and so forth. And now it's more, you know, kind of somewhat true crime that's real popular, espionage and spies, and, you know, James Bond was always a popular thing that people wanted to get out and watch the latest James Bond movie, you know. And of course James Bond was teaching about positive character and how to make choices when, you know, people tried to do things that brought about trespass, right? That's what was coming out of the headlights of his little Aston Martin, right? No, it wasn't character traits coming out of there. It was usually bullets, right? You know, even the superhero movies that has been mentioned in times past, you know, there were some aspects, a little bit of aspects of morality that were presented in the movies. You know, well, no, I can't lie, or no, I shouldn't take something that doesn't belong to someone. You know, but soon as the bad guy's doing something, here comes the superhero, right? And is throwing them into the wall, right? Or, you know, flinging them into the air, you know, 100 feet or whatever, landing in a pond or whatever. You know, the superheroes don't even have self-control, right? You know, they don't even consider their actions and what they'll bring on another person. And of course, these are the things that are going in the minds of the young people, because they're watching these things like, yeah, cool, all right. You know, because he's the superhero or she's the superhero. So if they do something that hurts the bad guy, that's okay, because they had it coming anyway, right? Now this is a part of the method of teaching, you know, but it's not a distinguishing between positive and negative behavior. It's just, hey, if a person's bad and you're quote unquote good, this is what you're allowed to do. Now, the bad guy can't do that, but the great guy can. Okay? So, as a teacher, this is something that you're up against, because there are so many of those influences that are ever so present in society, as we're going to read as we go over some of these statistics and these articles here, that it is more harmless than you think, right? The old saying, what you don't know won't hurt you. Well, it's actually the opposite. What you don't know will hurt you, because knowledge is power. And if you don't know about these things, if a person is not able to distinguish between positive and negative, then they'll willingly subject themselves to negative influences that are going to affect their behavior, their values. Of course, remember, anything that can affect your values can affect your character. And as a result, in affecting your character, it's going to affect your choices. And your choices, so many other things are going to trail behind you in life and go in front of you in life, aka your reputation, that we'll get into later here, that you can't, it's not so easy to shake that off, right? Sometimes people go to great extremes when their reputation is ruined, and they'll go and move locations, change their names, and try to create a new life for themselves because, some things that have occurred that are so horrendous that they actually had to just completely leave not only the town that they lived in, but their complete state, sometimes even their country. So we're going to pick up on page 124, and we're still in procedure 4. I want to make sure that's the right one. Yeah, we're still within that procedure 4, so we don't necessarily have to go back and read this class. And if you look over on page 124, under Did You Know, and this is a reiteration of some of these facts that were covered, that we were going over. They kind of tie in with what we covered on page 122. And we have just 3 points here. It says the average American teenager spends 15,000 hours watching television compared to 12,000 hours in the classroom. And that is, I think they figure that for, the amount of time or whatever that, I'm not sure exactly where, but I know the average school year is 1,000 hours, okay? So if it's that 12 years and so forth, which it was pretty low at this time, it's much higher than what that was reported previously. And let's see here. I have some notes to go with this. Yeah. And, this was gone over before in a previous class. I just wanted to go over it again here in case someone's just joining us. The average American teenager spends 15,000 hours watching television compared to 12,000 hours in the classroom. Now, that's obviously not in a year, but over a period of time. And this is a report from CNN, and of course, this is from 2019. Not anything new, but when you go back and look up some of these statistics, like the number 2 one there, by age 18, a teenager will have seen 350,000 commercials. That number is kind of stagnated. I don't think because teenagers are seeing that much or less commercials, it's just no studies are being made on it, okay? I can guarantee you teenagers are seeing way more commercials now than what they were back in the early 2000s. But it says U.S. teens, this is from CNN, U.S. teens use screens more than 7 hours a day on average. And that's not including schoolwork. And I think Chris mentioned something about this when he was teaching his class, because that schoolwork increases that time as well. But again, if it's for school and learning and something that's beneficial, well, that's not bad, right? And this is, it says, U.S. teens spend an average of more than 7 hours per day. So if you figure, it says more than 7 hours. If it was 8, then it probably would have said 8 or more. You figure 7.5 hours, 7.5 hours per day over the average year, right? 12-month year. That's 2,737.5 hours a year watching television. Now, the average full-time job for a working adult at 40 hours a year is right at 2,000 hours. 2,000 hours, right? So they almost spend 1/3, a little actually over 1/3 time more in front of a television than the average adult spends working all year. 737.5 more hours in front of a television. And that's per day on-screen media, entertainment, And tweens, that's between that age of, 11 and 12, 10, 12, and so forth, spend nearly 5 hours, the report finds. Now, that does not include time spent using screens for school. It says among teens, the amount of time dedicated to several individual screen activities inched up by 42 minutes per day since 2015. So this report was given in 2019. That was 2015, 4 years prior. We're another 3 years past that. Okay, again, you can pretty much be assured that the amount of time spending watching television or being on media, social media for entertainment has not decreased. In fact, it's increased even more. As you'll see the numbers of the young people who have media devices or cell phones as we get to later. It says a report said nearly 62% spend more than 4 hours a day on screen media, and 29% use screens more than 8 hours a day, according to a report by Common Sense Media. And then they give you the risk here. It says it includes the potential. Now, this is for continuing watching all this television, spending all this time on social media and entertainment. Risks include the potential for youth to be exposed to harmful messages online. That is, spending this 2,700 or so hours per year in front of a screen. These researchers are acknowledging that it includes the potential for youth to be exposed to harmful messages online and for them to become more socially isolated from their peers because of more individualized content viewing. In other words, they want to stay home or stay in their rooms and watch television rather than what most of us probably used to do back in the 80s and 90s, go out and interact, with our peers, with our friends, whether it was going to the park or riding a bike or, whatever. There was a lot more of that before all of the social media and cell phones and the internet ever existed. And most young people today can't even imagine what the world would be like without the internet. We grew up without it. We grew up without computers. We grew up without cell phones. I mean, a cell phone, was like this big if you wanted to carry it. And that was just a receiver. You had another one that big for the for the telephone part, and a big cord and this antenna that you had to pull out, if you wanted to get a decent signal. And of course you had to be careful of the planes flying overhead. But minutes were like I don't remember, it was like 50 or 75 cents per minute. If you're on your anytime minutes, it was crazy. So it was a big discouragement from getting cell phones when they first came out, because it was an extremely expensive cost. Everybody waited till after 9 o'clock so they can have their free nights and their free weekends when those finally started coming in. But now it's, you can buy a cheap phone, at, they call them burner phones, and get you one of those SIM cards, and you can have, pretty much unlimited data and messaging. And you can just spend all the time that you want, right? And as far as I know, I don't know if you have to be, over 18 or anything to buy a phone like that at any store. So no one's going to really question the child what they're doing, so they can, get these things and their parents don't even know about it. Researchers analyzed data from a nationally representative survey of more than 1,600 tweens age 8 to 12, so that's the tween age, between 8 to 12, and teens 13 to 18 about their relationship with media. And they tracked changes in youth media behaviors, comparing current results to those found in the first wave of the study in 2015. And they showed here, I don't want to go through all of this, but although YouTube, they show the different videos and the platforms that young people watch, it says, although YouTube says its content is only, now this is what YouTube says, their content is only for those 13 and older, 76% of tweens. Now remember what we said, a tween is 8 to 12. 76% of tweens say they use the site, and only 23% use YouTube Kids, which is a YouTube meant to be safer viewing environment for young people. Among tweens, 53% said YouTube is the site they watch the most, compared to just 7% for YouTube Kids. So we can see there that these things are out there influencing them. And, even though these platforms say, you have to be, 13, or this is for 13 years or older, or you have to be 16, or you have to be 18, there's not really anybody checking these things, right? How hard is it to put a different age in a profile? Not hard at all. People lie all the time. So we see there, that's something that's given in the first statistics. The second one is by age 18, a teenager will have seen 350,000 commercials. Now, they're still commercials. Mostly they're just called ads now, but a commercial is an advertisement, or depending on where you're from, advertisement, right? Even if you go on YouTube, even if a channel is not monetized, YouTube now has a thing where they monetize it. They'll take it and say, well, if you're not, then we'll go ahead and start, selling advertisements on your channel. And that's what they do. And so they'll run these ads. Sometimes you can skip them, sometimes you can't. But those are commercials. People are seeing those things. And they could be a number of things that usually tie into things like cookies, and they'll play ads based on either other things that are in your search history that can easily be drawn off of, or content that you've searched online on YouTube or whatever the platform might be. They'll play advertisements based on that. And then the last one there, it says the average teenager spends more time in front of television than any other activity. So again, if you just take into consideration that 2,737.5 hours a year, the average hours teens spend in school during a normal year, it says on average, school children in America spend approximately 1,000 hours a year in school. So already their television time is almost, it's double, it's nearly triple, right, what they spend in school. And I guarantee you most people aren't leaving school talking about the lessons that they're going over. They're not rehearsing, reiterating those things, unless, hey, you going to be ready for the test tomorrow? Oh, what, there's a test? Okay. And then they're going to be going over it, and they're going to cram to the last minute to get that in. But for the most part, it's about the things, talking about what they've been watching on television or seeing on social media or TikTok or whatever. And it says this translates to about 6 hours a day spent in school. Now remember, we covered the amount of time spent television is over 7 hours. So already they've got at least the amount of time they spent in school beat by an hour. Television has their minds the rest of the time, more than what they've learned in school. And I guarantee you, because what's on the television is way more entertaining than what's in school for most people, that's what's going to stick the most, okay? And this is just things to, as teachers, help you remember what you're up against, okay? These are the influences that are coming, bombarding our students daily, right, for now, that we have to deal with in working around their behavior. The study suggests that schools that have their students spend more on task. Let me see here. Oh, anyway, it's just showing that when schools that actually keep children in school longer, they perform better with their lessons. It says average time per year teens spend on extracurricular activities. So we have the time in school, and then we have extracurricular activities. It might be sports, or newspaper, the school newspaper, or debate team, or whatever the case might be. Extracurricular activities outside of normal school hours. Kids spend an average of 9.6 hours Monday through Friday on outside activities, with private school kids putting in about 20% more time than their public school counterparts. Almost all of the kids, 87%, reported all the extracurriculars because they enjoyed them, not because their parents or college counselors told them to do. So they're doing these things because they enjoy them. Why do you think they're watching television? Because they enjoy it. Why are they going to school? not because they enjoy it, but because they have to. Now, some students actually do enjoy going to school. So that's not a general across the board for everybody. But this just gives you a comparison that with all of these things that we're seeing here, time at school, extracurricular activities and so forth, television, social media, entertainment still by far outweighs all of it. All right, so we're going to move over to page 125 here as we continue on with the same theme. And it says, monkey see, monkey do. And I think a lot of us have heard that growing up, monkey see, monkey do. I remember hearing it, oh, well, what? Well, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge too? Or if he jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? I've heard these things growing up many times when I made bad choices. They were bad choices, that I made when I was growing up, not really taking into consideration that I was even being influenced. I didn't know anything about influences. I don't even know if I even understood the word influence when I was growing up. I know I've heard it, but nobody ever taught me what an influence is and what is a bad or a great influence. I probably heard the statement, that person's a bad influence on you, but nothing went with telling me how to recognize and why that person is a bad influence, right? And this is the benefit of the peaceful solution. It doesn't just tell you what it is and what you need to watch out for, but also how to categorize these things into positive and negative, and to keep yourself from falling into the trap of a negative influence or being one yourself. Now, in addition to acts of violence, there are also graphic and explicit messages about sex on both TV and in the movies. These movies rarely show the consequences that come from promiscuous sex outside of marriage. These consequences include incurable sexually transmitted diseases, or STDs for short. STIs is also another popular term that's used in the world, especially when they talk about reproductive health. A lot of times they'll classify these things as sexually transmitted infections. These consequences include incurable sexually transmitted diseases, teenage pregnancy, and feelings of guilt and shame when young people engage in these things because of pressure or a desire to fit in. And then once that takes place, a lot of young people admit that they felt guilty. They felt shame as a result of engaging in promiscuity. The American Psychological Association estimates that teenagers are exposed to, now get this number, 14,000 sexual references per year on television. In a 2001 study of primetime television by the Kaiser Family Foundation concluded that 75% of programs include sexual content, and nearly 6 scenes per hour contain sexual talk and or behavior. Sexual talk and or behavior. Now, in that talk is included the phrase innuendos, sexual innuendo, saying things without directly saying it, but in reference to something related to, sex, right? And these are used a lot, to kind of skirt around the mentioning of the actual act. But it impresses in the mind of the person, and it's usually coupled with some type of, comedy or something, to make the person, the viewer, laugh. It impresses in their mind that this is how men and women interact. This is okay. I've seen it on television, I've seen it in movies. Now young people aren't thinking that way. They're not necessarily thinking that, this makes sense, right? This is teaching me how to be a man, or this is teaching me how to be a woman, and this is teaching me how to interact with the opposite sex. No, they're just seeing these things. They're going into their minds. It's funny. It's entertaining. This person looks great. That person looks hot. Well, I've seen how they get the girl, or I've seen how she gets the guy, right? So if it worked for them, why not give it a shot? Okay? And the reality of it, like we just covered here, it doesn't show the consequences of what takes place. It doesn't show the consequences of the broken homes, the families, the statutory rape charges when things take place with teachers and people that are supposed to be in authority and watching over and protecting children and so forth. And the STIs and the things that go with that, the diseases that get passed on to the children, and the birth defects that come as a result of how some of these diseases actually affect the child while they're in gestation, while they're in the womb of the mother. Okay, but these things are there, and it would be great not that they would promote this, but skip past all that and show real life afterwards, right? The reality of what life is when people make impulsive choices based on emotions and not practicing self-control. Let's see here. I was just trying to see if I wanted to mention this or not. No, that's okay. That's on a different topic there, but we'll probably be able to bring it in a little bit here. It says just the facts. So this is on, we're still on page 125 in the middle there. Just the facts. 4 out of 10 teenagers say they have gotten ideas on how to talk to their boyfriends or girlfriends about sexual issues from entertainment media. Now think about that. First off, they've got boyfriends and girlfriends, and I'm talking about friends that are in school, that are boys or girls. Typically it's, when we were growing up, they used to call it playing house, right? Playing house. You had a mommy and you had a daddy. I'll be the mommy, you be the daddy, or whatever, right? And they would sometimes imitate the things that they saw their parents doing, okay? And when they become teenagers, that mindset continues on, it carries on. Well, why? Well, in innocence, to some degree, young people, preteens, they just see things taking place and they just copy it. Well, when you get a little bit older, there's a thing called puberty and hormones and things like that start pumping hormones through the body, estrogen and testosterone and so forth for the respective female and male. And that, that is something that starts to get the minds thinking about, should be starting the minds to get to thinking about a family, right? Raising a family, finding the right partner, a man finding a right wife and so forth, and starting a family and raising a family and continuing, hopefully, a trend on training your children in positive character education and so forth. Well, when those things are raging throughout the child's body, the teenager's body, and they have no guidance on how to deal with that, they don't talk to anybody about that, they're not, set down and instructed on, hey, now you're going to start to get these feelings, you're going to start to get these thoughts, right? You're going to start to, like we talked about before in the previous units there, went from yucky to not so bad after all. Well, that's a normal thing, right? But you can't just make decisions based on how you feel or how those emotions, because hormones are an influence, right? Whether a person realizes that or not, they're an influence. Now, it's not an external influence per se, it's an internal influence. It's coming from within, something that's driving you and creating certain desires within an individual for certain things, okay? But it's got to be governed based on morality. The decisions that are made in regards to those things have to be still followed based on morality. They can't lash out and go and just attack people because they're feeling a certain way. Sadly, in society, people do that. They go and they lash out and they try to fulfill those desires in an immoral way. And with that comes consequences. But notice, they're looking at television, entertainment, media, on how to talk to their girlfriends or boyfriends about sexual issues. Now, they shouldn't be talking to their girlfriends or boyfriends about sexual issues, right? First off, they shouldn't be having sexual issues. They should be talking to a trusted adult. If there are thoughts or feelings or questions that they have, they should be talking to someone who can guide them properly. And this is a part of, in school, what guidance counselors are for, right? As teachers, when certain questions are presented to us, in many cases, we direct them to the guidance counselors because that's what the guidance counselor's job is to do. When they can, it's beneficial that they talk to their parents about those types of things, right? Because the parents should be able to guide a father guide a young man, and a mother guide a young woman on the things that they're going through, and how to deal with them properly so they don't get themselves in trouble. Because what occurs when you have two people talking about these types of issues, using hormones that influence emotions without the knowledge and the self-control to make proper decisions. Right? When they both have that desire, eventually they're going to do something that they very well might regret later. Okay? The next point here is 3 out of 4 teens, or 75%, say one reason teenagers have sex is that TV shows and movies make it seem normal for teenagers to have sex. And that is true. It's even more prevalent today than it was when I was growing up. I remember it was mostly in movies when I was growing up, and my parents wouldn't let me watch those types of movies, but when I did get old enough and I was able to, and I did see those things, I remember that's what was in there. And it was a lot of times teenagers, high schoolers, college, freshmen and so forth, and the people in their college years. That's what the big push was. When young people wanted to have fun, it always included drinking and sex. And it says TV and movies make it seem normal. Remember what we said about normal. Just because something's normal doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's moral. Normal does not equate to moral, okay? But again, what we're seeing here are influences that are coming from a very prevalent source to young people. Over 2,700 hours worth of it every year. And this is what they have to contend with. So what do you think is going to be the biggest influencing factor in their mind? Right? These shows, these television shows, the movies, even like we mentioned in video games, and some of these cutscenes, those things are in there as well. All right? And, well, it's not so bad because it's just a video game. It's just animation. It's just anime, right? There's a whole culture for that too. Anime, Japanese anime, where that's promoted there too. And it's just a cartoon. It's just a drawing. It's not hurting anybody. Well, the fact is, it is. Remember what we talked about, William mentioned it in the last class about your subconscious mind. It does not distinguish between reality and fantasy, right? When you see certain things, whether it's real or whether it's animated, it's invoking certain emotions and feelings and thoughts in a person's mind. And those are real. Those are real, okay? So you can't use the excuse, well, it's a cartoon or it's just an animation or something like that. No, there's still influences to the individual who sees them. And remember why they said they watch these things. Young people said that they watch these things because they enjoy them, okay? Not because it's a school project, but because they enjoy it. When you enjoy something, you remember it a lot more. And lastly, it says in a study of 13 to 14-year-olds, heavy exposure to sexually oriented television increased acceptance of premarital sex. All right, and that that also goes with the sexually explicit and the violent shows that we mentioned before. In one of these studies, it talks about how they kind of discovered that people who had a tendency to, it's kind of interesting in the study because it kind of goes along with desensitization, right? People who had a violent kind of character, a violent way of dealing with things, or they called it aggressive. An aggressive group, they had an aggressive group and a non-aggressive group. And when the aggressive group watched violent content on television, this was a study that they did, I don't remember how many people they had, but anyway, when an aggressive group watched violent content on television, the readings of their heartbeat, their blood pressure, their breathing actually went down. They were pretty relaxed as they watched those things. When the non-aggressive group watched those same violent acts on television, their heart rate went up, their respiration, their breathing, it went up, their blood pressure went up, right? Because they were seeing these things and they were being affected by it. They weren't desensitized to it, right? Whereas the aggressive group, is actually pretty calming to relaxing to watch somebody get hacked to pieces, That's probably exactly how I would do it, That's the desensitization that we mentioned in the previous pages there. And this is how it affects people. And it was interesting because in regards to television, this is from mghclaycenter.org. It says, before we address today's changes, this is some excerpts from the article, I didn't copy the whole thing. Let's take a moment to address some of the shifts in TV patterns that occurred in the last 40 years, because this was also a study that they did on the amount of television that people were exposed to. And that'll help put our conclusions into perspective. It says in 1950, all right, 1950, only 10% of homes in the United States had televisions in 1950. So that's, what, 62 years ago? No. Yeah, that's 62 years ago, right? Oh, wait, no. That's 72 years ago. Is that right? 72 years ago. Okay. I had to do my numbers in my head there. 6 and 7, right? 72 years ago. So just 72 years ago, 10% of homes in the United States had television. Now, we have a little over, I don't know how many homes we have, but, over 300 million people in the United States right now. Was probably way less in 1950. But you could figure that it was several million homes in the United States at that time. Families, average four people in a family, usually a husband and wife with a son and a daughter, sometimes more. Usually it was a lot more back in the 50s than it is now, but only 10% of homes. Now by 1996, all right, 1996, a mere 46 years later, approximately 99% of U.S. homes had televisions. 99%. So in just 46 years, it went from 10%, because I'm sure televisions were kind of really becoming a little more popular, and they probably were pretty expensive back in the 1950s. This huge big box with a screen about that big, and it was probably black and white to watch. But in 46 years, 99% of U.S. homes had television. So remember, not that there weren't influences before television. There always were influences. But now, before you had to go out. You wanted to watch a picture show, you had to go out to the movies. You had to go out to the theater. You wanted to watch a play, you had to go out, hop in your horse and your buggy or your Model T or whatever, or walk. You had to go to that place to watch it. Now with televisions, 99% of people in America, all it was just a click of a button. And they can have all of that entertainment brought right before them into their very living room. And that, we talked about it in the previous classes, that they had whole themes based around television. TV trays, TV dinners, things you can set up while you were sitting on the sofa, and you can have your little cup holders and things like that to watch television while you're doing other activities. It says 99% of U.S. homes had televisions, with 54% of children having TV sets in their bedrooms and spending an average, now this was back in 1996, an average of 28 hours per week watching television. Now whether it was Howdy Doody or the Get Along Gang or whatever it was they were watching, they were still spending 28 hours by 1996 watching television. So as we can see, if we were to look at a chart of a graph, that amount of time spent watching television, coupled with the availability of entertainment resources or platforms, which it's available on phones. It's right there. In fact, let me see. I just want to make sure. I don't know if I printed that or not. It was. I don't think I printed it, but it was telling about the. Oh, here it is. It says 53% of kids have their own smartphone by age 11. Now, this was the study from CNN there back in 2019. And nearly 70% have one by age 12. So remember, we're talking about the influences and how this is getting younger and younger and younger age groups. Ownership among tweens, remember 8 to 12, increased from 24% in 2015, that is ownership of smartphones, to 41% in 2019, and from 67% to 84% among teens. Among 8-year-olds, you're nearly 1 in 5 now have their own smartphone. 8-year-olds. We're talking about elementary age children. We're talking about children in 3rd grade have their own smartphones. I don't know if I had my own bike when I was in 3rd grade. And they have their own smartphones, basically their own powerful computer that links them to any place that they want to connect to in the world. And then this one article from MountSinai.org at the very end in regards to aggression in television, it says this could be the root of the differences in people who are aggressive and not aggressive and how media motivates them to do certain things. And they were talking about these results of seeing violent entertainment and so forth. It says, hopefully these results will give educators an opportunity to identify children with aggressive traits and teach them to be more aware of how aggressive material activates them specifically. In other words, showing that it is a trigger, right? It is a trigger to young people acting out these things that they see on television, not just with aggression, but also sexually explicit content. In this previous article about the homes with television, it says, it would seem that even before technology brought TV into our laptops and smartphones, kids were watching a lot. This means that the pull of TV programming, and remember what William brought out about the programming, training or programming your mind, is powerful and only getting stronger. Though this is hardly a new revelation. The real question is whether TV can make kids act differently. Specifically, do kids get more promiscuous or more violent from watching violent or sexually provocative content? And this was a question that was posed from this study that was done from nghclaycenter.org. Well, we've got the answer that says it right here that we just went over on page 125. 4 out of 10 teenagers get ideas to talk to their girlfriends or boyfriends about sexual issues from the media. 13 to 14-year-olds, heavy exposure to sexually oriented content, television increased the acceptance of premarital sex. And for most of the teenagers, television makes it seem normal. So yeah, these things are influences. They're asking these questions. The answers are here from their very own studies. You know, the Peaceful Solution didn't make these things up. They're getting this information from research as well. Well, based on the above information, do you think that seeing numerous TV shows and movies contributes to increased sexual behavior within your age group? And then, as you give your students the opportunity to answer these things. Now, in their students' workbook, they will have this little questionnaire here, and it asks them to explain their answer. And of course, it could be yes, because media strongly influences the behavior of teens. And it does, and it still does, and it will for a long time, but that influence does not necessarily have to be negative. Once society sees what it has brought, eventually through education and acceptance of what has taken place, things will eventually begin to change. But before we close out here, because I want to keep this on, I'll let David pick up on the next More Than Just a Great Beat. I understand he's an excellent singer. Some of the other things that affect young people in this monkey see, monkey do, just beyond sexual experiences and influences and so forth. And we brought this out before, and some of the social media challenges that we've seen. A lot of young people, because they're so enthralled with the influences coming from so many different platforms, they see it, they think it's fun, they get involved with it, and some of these things bring about consequences as well. In fact, we had to cover some of these on in a presentation, a Peaceful Solution presentation, in regards to this very topic. But here are some top social media trends and some of their consequences. How many of you have ever had allergies? I have allergies. They affect me different ways at different times. I don't know if you've ever taken Benadryl. Some people do. It kind of helps suppress some of those symptoms of allergies. It's actually used sometimes in emergencies and hospitals when people are suffering a severe allergic reaction. Well, there was something called the Benadryl challenge, and it encouraged, now notice here, this challenge encouraged TikTok users, and that's a social media platform, to take excessive amounts of the medication to try to experience a high that could cause hallucinations. Now, the FDA asked TikTok to remove the videos, warning that taking too much of the medication can lead to serious heart problems, seizures, coma, or even death. Benadryl challenge, okay. What about anybody here of the coronavirus out there? I don't know if anybody's heard of that. Yeah, that's been affecting the world for the last 2 years or so, since late 2019, early 2020. Well, in March last year, a so-called coronavirus challenge, and some of you might have heard about this, which I was actually appalled when I heard about it, was circulating on social media and encouraged people to lick items in public. Coronavirus or not, who wants to lick items in public? One person I actually saw, this was some TikTok influencer, she actually on an airplane licked the toilet seat. Yeah, the toilet seat, all right? I can only imagine what her breath smelled like. Well, at the time, the coronavirus challenge hashtag had almost 100 million views on TikTok. And nearly a year later, that hashtag had 3.1 billion views. 3.1 billion views of people who wanted to see other people licking items, and then it was a various amount of items. Some of them were toilet seats, some of them were door handles. I mean, just the various amounts of things. See people lick things to see if they would get coronavirus. There's another one that was real popular, and it's to some degree still popular. It was called the Blackout Challenge. Okay, this is not disconnecting power to your house and seeing if you can survive. But this, it didn't originate on TikTok, but was circulating on an app last year, and it involves restricting your own breathing, so pretty much suffocating yourself, in an attempt to experience a high. Now remember what we covered in here about influence and not allowing people to do things to bring you down to their level, but can be extremely dangerous and resulted in the death of a 10-year-old girl in Italy. And many more young people have died as a result of it as well. Then there's this nutmeg challenge. Now, most people are familiar with nutmeg for like snickerdoodles or something in a baked snack or dessert. This involved users mixing tablespoons of nutmeg with milk or water and drinking in the hopes of achieving, in the hopes, they forgot an E here, but with the hopes of achieving a high off of this spice. Large amount of nutmeg can be intoxicating, but can also cause dangerous side effects like hypothermia, hallucinations, coma, and death. And then lastly here, there was the throw it in the air challenge, where I was like, do people just sit in a room and think of these things? It's almost kind of mind-boggling, you know. Not really people from my generation that's doing this. It's the Gen Zers mostly. And this is the throw it in the air challenge, involved a group of friends standing in a circle, looking down at a cell phone on the ground, so the cell phone was recording them. Someone would throw an object into the air, and the challenge is to not flinch as you watch it fall on your head. Now, how safe do you think that is, right? I mean, some of the most insane things that people do, and the majority of these things, and this is some of the influences, is young people, they want to become famous on the internet, which is an influence. They want to become famous. 100 million views, 3.1 billion views, or hashtag following, videos. Yeah, it's a push to get them to do things, and some of these things are very harmful to their health and harmful to other people's health as well. This is our current reality, and as teachers, we have to be mindful of these things so that we can take the principles, the values, the concepts that we're bringing forth, the character traits in these books, and relay it to them in a way that they can understand. There's very many dangers out there in a lot of these influences, but they don't have to succumb to them. If they can distinguish between what's positive and negative, what's harmful and beneficial, then they can separate the two and make a choice that won't bring harm to themselves, others, or the environment. Well, we're going to stop right there on page 125, and David will pick up next class on page 126, and that class will be this upcoming Wednesday, June 22nd, or 6/22 at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. We'll see you next class.